Before we begin, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. I am John Lawrence, and on my channel, John Lawrence, we follow the military and economic pressure points that decide wars long before front lines move. Tonight, the story begins in the dark over the Black Sea, where Ukraine launched not just a strike, but a carefully staged deception. At 0325 local time, 25 UJ-26 Bober drones lifted off from Odessa, crossed the central Black Sea, and turned toward Russia's oil storage complex in Krasnodar region. But this attack was never about speed alone. It was about forcing Russia to see the wrong picture at the worst possible moment. Ukrainian planners knew the Nebo-M early warning radar near Novorossiysk would detect the formation almost immediately. They wanted that detection. They wanted Russian operators to believe they were watching something far more dangerous than low-flying drones. They wanted panic, delay, and a fatal mistake in the first layer of defense. Russia's first interception belt sat along the Black Sea coast southeast of the radar site. The moment the drones climbed above roughly 150 feet, the Nebo-M screen lit up with 25 heat signatures advancing toward the coastline. Inside the command post, alarms sounded at once. The flight profile looked deeply familiar. The targets climbed at a steep angle, accelerated fast, and moved in a synchronized pattern that matched a tactical missile salvo. The radar needed only a few fixes to build a prediction. One reading gave the initial position. The next gave speed. The third delivered the projected direction. Within seconds, the system classified the incoming objects as something resembling MGM-140 ATACMS missiles with an estimated impact in about half a minute. The data looked clean. The climb was sharp. The speed curve fit. The attack profile matched what Russian crews had been trained to fear. Physics appeared to confirm the conclusion. But Ukraine was not trying to defeat physics. It was trying to exploit the way human operators trusted it. The countdown began, then the expected impacts never came. Russian crews watched the screen as the track simply vanished in midair around 6 miles beyond the initial detection zone. No descent, no detonation, no terminal strike. For a few seconds, the silence was more dangerous than any explosion. Then the operator understood what had happened. These were not ballistic weapons at all. They had climbed just high enough to imitate a missile launch, then dropped below the radar horizon over the sea. Above land, a system like Nebo-M can often retain low altitude tracking under favorable conditions. Over water, things change. Sea clutter, reflections, and wave movement create blind pockets and unstable returns. The drones had used that weakness perfectly. They were never committed to a falling arc. They were free to level off, change profile, and disappear into the background. Russia had spent critical seconds waiting for impacts that were never coming, while the real threat slid lower, moved farther, and turned the first warning network into a trap. The operator switched from ballistic tracking to cruise mode and pushed an urgent warning to the Black Sea Fleet radar network. By then, the formation had already advanced well beyond its last fixed point. At about 100 miles per hour, those missing seconds mattered. Naval radar soon reacquired the targets at roughly 50 miles. Now the picture looked entirely different. The drones were hugging the sea at altitudes between 60 and 100 feet, rising and dipping with the surface below them. They were spread out, not stacked tightly together. That made the next problem even worse: identification. In a battle space crowded with drones, a radar return alone no longer answers the most important question. Russian units checked the mission database. No friendly flight was scheduled through that corridor, but special operations flights were not always logged in real time. The targets were radio silent. Their speed could match several systems used by both sides. They were off route, low, and ambiguous. The formation had to be marked as unidentified and potentially hostile, but not with full certainty. That hesitation bought Ukraine more time. An aerial inspection order went out to Kushchevskaya Air Base, and a Su-35S squadron was scrambled to investigate. At 0342, one pilot received the heading and the summary through encrypted link. 25 slow contacts, low altitude, unknown identity, fire only after confirmation. He turned west toward the pale horizon. where sea and sky were barely beginning to separate in the dawn light. But tracking the drones proved far harder than the warning network had suggested. The Su-35S carried the powerful Urbis-E radar, built to find aircraft, bombers, and larger cruise missiles. These targets were something else. The UJ-26 Bober was small, constructed with materials that reflected little radar energy, and it flew almost on top of the water. At 15 miles, the pilot saw only unstable flickers, brief contacts that appeared and vanished like ghosts against the surface. He switched to infrared search, then to passive electronic scanning. Still, the returns remained weak. No strong heat trail, no clean signal emissions, no reliable electronic fingerprint. The ambiguity was now inside the cockpit. At about 8 miles, the pilot finally caught sight of them through the morning haze. Dark shapes, low and scattered across the water, drifting northeast in a broad spread. They did not resemble a normal formation. They looked like machines built to make identification as difficult as possible. He ran through the standard matrix. First came friend or foe interrogation, no answer. That settled nothing because most drones do not carry the transponders used by manned aircraft. Then came profile analysis. Speed near 100 miles per hour, altitude low, course toward the Black Sea coast, still inconclusive. The same numbers could fit reconnaissance platforms, modified one-way drones, or systems captured and reused on either side. That left visual confirmation. To get it, he had to close rapidly at more than 250 miles per hour while the targets crawled forward at less than half that speed. Dawn haze reduced every second. He armed his weapons, but each option had limits. Heat seekers struggled with small engines. Radar missiles struggled with sea level clutter. The cannon required a dangerously close pass. He had almost no margin for error. Ground control demanded identification. The pilot answered that he still could not confirm. Then came the order to move closer without firing. He dropped lower, brought the Su-35S alongside the right edge of the formation, and prepared for a pass that would last only seconds. Fuel was already becoming a concern. Low altitude flight burns fast, and every correction costs more. Then, at roughly half a mile, the shapes finally resolved. Small fuselage, narrow wings, low dispersed pattern. These were not Russian reconnaissance drones returning home. They were Ukrainian UJ-26 Bobers. The decision came instantly. The Su-35S locked several targets and launched 4 R-77 missiles in quick succession. 4 drones disappeared. Then the pilot closed again, switched to the 30-millimeter cannon, and tore through the edge of the formation. 2 more fell into the sea. In less than a minute, 6 attackers were gone, but Ukraine adapted immediately. The surviving drones broke apart across a much wider corridor, dropped even lower, and forced the fighter to chase one machine at a time instead of attacking a cluster. The Su-35S managed one more kill with the cannon, but the engagement was turning against the interceptor in a different way. Every turn, every low altitude pass, every acceleration through dense air consumed fuel at a punishing rate. The drones did not need to defeat the fighter in combat. They only needed to stretch the chase until time and fuel did the rest. That is exactly what happened. The pilot checked the gauge and understood he could no longer remain in the fight safely. He reported that continued pursuit was no longer possible and requested handoff to Coastal Air Defense. Permission came back at once. The Su-35S climbed and turned for base, leaving 18 drones still moving low over the sea toward the oil depot. By 0445, the mission had passed to the Pantsir S-1 battery guarding the final approach near Cape Idakapas. For the crew there, the radio network had already become a stream of confusion and urgency. Now the task was simple in theory and brutal in practice. Stop the remaining drones before they reach the storage complex. The Panzer battery shifted into combat mode as the returns grew clearer. 18 Bobers approached in a scattered pattern, changing altitude and refusing to present an easy target set. The first missile salvo went out fast. 6 missiles cut into the early morning air. 5 drones were destroyed. One escaped with a sharp, evasive move as a missile burst harmlessly over the water. Then the system switched to automatic cannon fire. Twin 30 millimeter guns poured a dense stream ahead of the formation, building a wall of metal over the sea surface. The fire was intense, but the drones were no longer bunched together. Each came in on a slightly different angle, forcing the crew to rotate, reacquire, and burn ammunition without decisive effect. Still, the barrage disrupted their path. It slowed them, it pinned them momentarily. Then one Bober changed the entire engagement. It pulled upward, rising clearly into the cannon line and exposing itself as an obvious target. The turret followed. The decoy was shredded, but at that exact moment, another drone stayed low, accelerated, and rushed straight at the Panzer itself. The crew saw the second drone too late. At less than 2 miles, they had only seconds left, and the turret was still recovering from the elevated firing angle used against the decoy above. The cannons tried to come back down, but not fast enough. The Bober struck the Panzer at close range and exploded. In a flash, radar launchers and control systems were swallowed in fire. Russia's last direct point defense on that route vanished from the combat network in seconds. The remaining drones kept coming, yet the Russians still faced one final dilemma. Around an oil depot, every round fired carries its own danger. A burst that misses, a fragment that falls badly, or a blast too near a storage tank can trigger the same disaster the defenders are trying to prevent. So the backup measure came into play. Operators brought up the Stuper anti-drone gun, a handheld electronic jammer meant to break control links and satellite navigation at short range. One leading Bober entered the jamming zone, lost stability, drifted off course, and dropped away. For a moment, it looked as if the last layer might still hold. But most of the remaining drones did not collapse when GPS and GLONASS were suppressed. Their guidance shifted automatically to inertial navigation and autonomous control. Once the satellite link disappeared, each drone used its last confirmed position as a reference and continued forward by calculating speed, direction, tilt, and drift internally. Over long distances, that method accumulates error. Over the final mile and a half, it was good enough. At 100 miles per hour, the drones needed only seconds more. The jammer could blind outside signals, but it could not erase the machine's memory of where it had been and where it was going. Russian crews kept jamming, hoping more drones would wobble out of line. A few dipped, shook, or lost some stability. Most stayed on course. Then the final dive began. Surveillance systems tracked the storage field below, a grid of steel tanks still holding residual heat from the day before. The drones compared what they saw against preloaded target data, fuel clusters, wind direction, spacing between tanks. The aim was no longer just impact, it was fire spread. At less than a mile, the lead drones tipped into steep dives. Engines eased off, gravity and momentum took over. The first impacts tore into one storage tank, rupturing steel and igniting the vapor zone above the fuel. Seconds later, another strike hit a second cluster where more volatile fuel burned harder and faster. Flames leapt from valves, lines, and open seams. What began as separate hits turned into a chain reaction moving across the depot. Within minutes, black smoke was rising high above the facility. Fire crews could not push deep into the complex because the heat was too intense and the risk of secondary blasts was too high. The result was not just local damage. It struck the logistics network feeding Russian operations around the Black Sea. Aircraft and supporting units were forced to limit activity because the fuel flow behind them had been burned away. This was the logic of the strike, not total destruction, precise disruption. If you have followed this investigation, subscribe to my channel, John Lawrence, comment with your thoughts, and share this report. Because in this war, the next fire may already be waiting behind the next silence.